Hey everybody, this video tonight is called Let Me Appear Before the Judge. And tonight we continue with this pass-through study in the book of Job, where we're looking at Job's desire to appear before God. So maybe the title scared you a little bit or threw back some flashbacks at you. And my question that I want to start out with is, have you ever wanted to face a judge? It's not very common that people want to go before a judge, whether it's a criminal appearance or a civil matter. And maybe you wanted to go before a judge because you hated the police department that had you held. But it's not common for people want to go before a judge. And I've had to go before a judge twice. Yes, even good old Christian boy me. Really, good is not part of my vocabulary. But I was criminally accused at one point in time back in 2018. And you'd probably never guess what my criminal accusation was about. And I'll let you think about it there for a few more seconds. What would I have been criminally charged with? So, back in November of 2018, right before Thanksgiving, I received a court summons, a criminal summons, to appear before a judge for failure to register my dog. I guess I'm not a good tax-paying citizen. But it was nerve-wracking to stand before a judge, even for something really petty or silly. And thankfully, my charge was dismissed at my arraignment. And it was an error of the city, as they didn't have the dog registered under both my wife and I. So what happened was, in 2017, I registered the dog for that year. I call it the dog tax. It comes up every March 31st. So you have to get a license to have a dog. You know, U.S. government, Massachusetts is known as Taxachusetts. They tax you for everything. So 2017, I went in and registered the dog for that year. In 2018 of March, my wife handled the matter. And so the city, instead of seeing, the dog at the same address, they thought we had two different dogs. And I didn't register the dog that year. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of comfort on that scenario. So let's begin anyways in Job chapter 23, verse 1 through 7. And it says here, Then Job answered and said, Even today my complaint is bitter. My hand is listless because of my groaning. Oh, that I knew where I might find him, that I might come to his seat. I would present my case before him and fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me, and understand that he would say to me, would he contend with me in his great power? No, but he would take note of me. There the upright could reason with him, and I would be delivered forever from my judge. So we're going to see in today's chapter, in our next chapter, that Job is going to back off with rebuking his friends. But we're going to see that Job is going to change his tone and his focus to longing for fellowship with God, so that he could experience the wonderful things of God, like God's love and God's goodness, and hear from him the meaning of all his suffering. And in verse 2, it says, Even today my complaint is bitter, my hand is listless because of my groaning. And so verse 2, even today, shows that Job had his friends in mind with what they've had said, hadn't connected with his situation, and it didn't bring any relief in his distress. And my hand is listless. It shows an expression of weariness and inability to act. And Job's grievous condition has drained him of his strength. And you probably know that feeling when you are under a great amount of stress. It is physically tiring. And in verse 3 it says, Oh, that I knew I might find him, that I might come to his seat. So verse 3, his seat, it refers to God acting as a judge, as we see going down into verse 7. And it's a place of judgment. In verse 4, I would present my case before him. So my case is Job's claim to have innocence. And then in verse 6 and 7, engage in court debate over evidence and witnesses, Job knew that God wasn't going to enter a contest with him to determine, as in a court case, who was right. But Job wanted God to at least listen to him, to hear his side. And he was so confident that he could make his case and be delivered by his just judge. And Job felt separated from God, and Job had felt utterly forsaken by God. In verse 8 and 9 it says, "Look, I go forward, but he is not there, and backward I cannot perceive him. When he works on my left hand, I cannot behold him. When he turns to the right hand, I cannot see him." So verses 8 and 9, Job hasn't been successful in ascertaining why God had afflicted him. And Job felt that God was invisible to him, but in verse 10, it will show that God has an all-seeing eye, that God is omniscient. And the four directions of movement are all-inclusive, and they possibly represent the east, west, north, and south. And Job insisted that he sought God in the midst of his crisis. And no matter how diligently or sincerely Job looked, he could not find God. And God remained hidden through a barrier that was impossible to pierce. This is how Job feels. In verse 10 through 12 it says, "But he knows the way that I take. When he has tested me, I shall come forth as gold. My foot has held fast to his steps. I have kept his way and not turned aside. I have not departed from the commandment of his lips. I have treasured the words of his mouth more than my necessary food." So even though Job could not sense God's presence, he believed that he was present and affirmed his commitment to God's purpose in this test. And his continued obedience to God's word, which were the most important issues in his life. And so Job, he declared that he still followed God, and that Job declared he still had a love for God's word. In verse 13 through 17, to finish the chapter, nice short chapter today, says, "But he is unique, and who can make him change? And whatever his soul desires, that he does. So he performs what is appointed for me, and many such things are with him. Therefore I am terrified at his presence. When I consider this, I am afraid of him. For God made my heart weak, and the Almighty terrifies me, because I was not cut off from the presence of darkness. And he did not hide deep darkness from my face." So Job's acceptance to God's sovereignty faltered at times in practice, but he returned to it repeatedly. And it's a great lesson of the book. And one thing, if you don't get anything out of the book of Job, one thing you should get out of it is to trust in our sovereign God when you cannot understand why things go badly in life. In Job, he affirms that God will surely accomplish what he desires for him. And Job kind of reminds me of 3 years ago, how I had to get through losing my oldest son just 3 years ago on January 9th. I had to trust in God's sovereignty in order to get through it. Because if I didn't trust that God was sovereign, I was in big trouble. There was no way that I would, be able to hold on to the Christian faith and, believing that things are out of order. And, no matter what I felt in the flesh, I can rest on God's sovereignty as a pillow with the blessed hope of being reunited with my son one day and serving and worshiping our King. And so Job affirms that God will surely accomplish what he desires for him. And Job realizes that there's much that he doesn't understand about God. And therefore, Job's going through like this daunted, dismayed phase before God. And despite the ordeal he is undergoing, his lack of comprehension of what is occurring and his overwhelming dread before God, we see that Job considers that he has no option but to continue to plead to be heard and vindicated. And so, to wrap up today's short video, we see tonight Job's desire to appear before God, before the judge, as he gave his bitter complaint and his inability to connect with God. And Job, in a way, experienced what Jesus experienced on the cross as a man who had previously been in fellowship and favor with God, and now he felt utterly forsaken. And I think of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, and his fleshly, he felt that he was forsaken by the Father. He said, God, why have you forsaken me? And this was the greatest source of torment in Job's life. In verse 8 and 9, it shows us that Job confessed that, I'm just a man. I'm a frail man. I don't understand what is happening. He had a lack of understanding, and he needed a divine revelation. And we see Job's confidence in the midst of his despair. And in verses 10 through 12, we see confidence in God and his own integrity. And we see that the chapter ends with Job's wonders at God's power and sovereignty. He reflects on God's sovereignty. So that's going to wrap up today's video. We'll see you next as we look at Job explaining the security of the wicked. And sometimes we feel like the wicked are getting away with things, and we'll talk about that in our next video. So I hope you have a great rest of your evening. God bless. We'll see you next time.